This is Progress Culture.
Progress Culture is a weekly happening where master drummer Paul F. Murphy and I share live improvised music and impromptu conversations with people from various fields and expertises about community, value, art, science, freedom, and progress for all. We are excited to share it all with you, so have a listen and see what's going on this week on Progress Culture. Now, let's get into the show. But first, let's hear some music. Hello everybody, Dominic Fragman and Paul Murphy here from the Spirit of Innovation and Freedom for this week's episode of Progress Culture. And it is an exciting week because we got some of the favorites in the house. We got Matt Hayes and Brian Jordan. What's going on, guys?
Hello.
Good
to
see you. Glad to be here.
There's a fair amount of noise in the hangar today, and noises that I haven't necessarily picked up on before. Lots of, almost like, you guys know what a vibroslap is?
No.
Yeah.
What is that, a vibroslap?
Have you ever heard the band Cake? It's in about every song they do. No, it's the thing where you hit it and it's like...
Oh, yeah.
It's called a vibroslap. I acquired one when I was a young teenager. They're fabulous. But there's definitely something over there that is very vibroslap-like.
Yeah, there's some like piece of trim on the outside of the building or something that vibrates in the wind. And we got a windy day, and we're in a big steel building and lots of creaky panels.
Yeah. Every time we finish a tune,
We got a little bit of mechanical ASMR
of
rolling in the
applause.
background.
hey man, I dig it. If it's it might be an airplane, it might be, I don't know. This I like that. Whenever I tell anybody that this is we film in an airplane hangar, they're like, it like blows their mind. Like, how did you work that out? Like, I don't know. I didn't work it out. Really. Anyway, I was sort of I was telling you guys earlier, I was excited that this is what the show was going to be today, because last time you were on, we talked about some really cool stuff like time crystallization and some different things that got into my thoughts about not really any extensive thoughts, just this idea that I have that somehow music or art will play a role in sort of expanding the time-space continuum of the unfolding of people's thinking, where we'll be able to more simultaneously perceive everything, I guess. Now, that might be a little bit delusional, but hey, that's where I live. So, but I can't remember what I was going to sort of jump back in on with you guys. But I was scanning my brain for something interesting to talk about. And one thing that I think it would be cool to rap with you guys about is if we were reading a history book right now, and it was a description or a name of this time period that we're in, as civilization, etc., what do you think that name or description? The name probably would be tough, but I'd like to hear what your thoughts are on it.
That's interesting.
But the name or the description of the historical epoch, or whatever the correct word is for what we're living in now.
Wow, that's a tough question. I don't even know how to answer that. It's kind of like it almost reminds me of the kind of post-industrial age of the early 1900s. That we're 100 years after that, so it's the age of internet, age of information, maybe.
The information age. I guess that's
I've heard it called that. So
yeah.
2020 vision.
2020 vision. I like that.
Era, if so it depends on the
Era.
time scale, right?
Yeah.
So eras, or maybe era is not the right term, but like the ages get defined in terms of humans by what you find in the archaeological record. Okay, so like Stone Age, the Iron Age, Bronze Age. The Stone Age, they probably built a lot more with wood than they did with stone, but you find the stone.
Right.
So our age would probably either be the plastic age or the silicon age.
Silicon age, yeah.
It's going to be one of those two, I'm guessing.
That's a really good point. But, if you think of something like that, like the Stone Age it's a very broad, very long period. And I guess you could say the same for the Silica Age. It might have started from 1945 to who knows how long we keep making stuff out of silicon or chips.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
It could be the concrete age too,
True.
Concrete or steel, or there's no one material that defines it that gets left behind anymore.
And it depends too. You have to think about from what reference point. Are you talking someone like my grandkids talking about us, or we're talking 1,000 years from now?
Yeah, so that's kind of why I went to the age thing, because if we're talking about it like what made the 1920s different from the 1930s, then yeah, not so much.
Exactly.
But
well, and my son's a philosopher, and we kind of talk, and he talks about how like George Washington wouldn't have been able to tell the difference between 1945 or say 1920 and 2020. To him, it would have all been just blew his mind.
Right, yeah, for sure.
So it's to him, it's all the same period. And so if you look, say 1,000 years from now, and someone finds a projector or something, what would they think? What would they think, depending on where they are? That if we've gone back to the Stone Age, what would they think it is? Or if they're more advanced than us, what would they think? I don't know.
So in let's go evolutionary scales. You get, these time periods that are kind of defined based on the fossils you get. You know, and you get like a couple million years where you primarily are finding like the jawbones of bony fish, and then you start to see fossilized plant coral showing up and whatnot. And then when you have a period where there's just like a ton of growth and everything's evolving because the world has been changing, like the climate change, the snow's gone, things can go on land, algae's happening, whatever, like some big thing happens. They call it an explosion, like the Cambrian explosion.
Right.
Because you got this whole time of a period, millions of years, where you get the same thing, and then you get like a couple 100,000 years where it's just like tons of stuff.
All kinds of things happening.
Yep.
Right.
And then at the end of that, you get a couple million years of the same kinds of things. So maybe we're in an explosion.
That's a really good point. Right. I guess something drove that explosion to a point where it exploded, it happened for a couple 100,000 years, and it stopped. Then all that just kind of stagnated, like for another couple million, and something else happened. So that's a really good point, because if you look at humans, we've only been here for what, 200,000, something like that, if that. And we had a huge explosion that happened with us, in the past 100 years. I mean, we've grown technology-wise greater in the past 100 years than we did the past 2,000 prior to that. So
it's interesting. I have this idea that I sort of kick around in my brain about how the progress of progress is becoming more rapid. So like when you would see before, we would have these time periods where, like you're saying, it would last for this very long time before there was a development that kicked it into the next whatever, right? And it seems to me that was going by at a much slower pace tens of thousands of years ago, thousands of years ago, to where we're getting to, even though like something like this idea about like a George Washington wouldn't know the difference between 1945 and 2020, I think that there is like this, at least in like when you look at a history book, we're breaking these things down by decades. When I was in school, it was like, you did by the decade. And I guess they would still do it that way now, but it seems like even that, if you go from tens of thousands to thousands to hundreds to decades, that things are rapidly changing.
Right.
And now they're rapidly changing faster than that. I feel like it, but I guess I don't know what it would feel like to be around 100 years ago or 5,000 years ago, and to feel what progress felt like.
Right.
But
I mean, when did we start measuring time in decades? It was the 20th century, because I would say, probably even the 19th, because there's a distinct difference between 1850 and 1860, 1870, 1880, so forth, so on, and certainly a big difference between 1950 and 1960, and by the period of dress in particular and technology.
Sure.
But when you look at history prior to that, let's take Rome, for instance. Rome, there was no technological advancements in Rome for 1,000 years.
Yeah.
They existed from, let's say, 500 BC to, if you look at the Eastern Roman Empire fell in 1400, there was really, honestly, no change other than gunpowder was the biggest technological advancement in that time. So
I'd say that's pretty significant.
Navigation.
it's navigation, but
Toilets.
toilets, but they still horse and buggy. There was no
Yeah.
there was no real hurdles or earth-shattering technological advancements in that time. Not until really the 1800s that we're really seeing the. Well, anyway, we were talking about decades and time, so
Sure.
I don't know how we measure that or what determines.
Well, the measurement of time is pretty slippery, elusive thing anyway,
Sure.
because you would go, if you even went to where we are beginning to measure time in a consistent way that we can communicate about, then you get to a point where, it's been at least, 80 to 100 years that we've said, it's been a little bit more than 100 years that we've said, there's no such thing as absolute time.
That's right.
So
Yeah. Yeah, it kind of screwed a few things up, didn't it?
that really did some stuff.
Well,
Yeah.
plus, we went from the Wright brothers to venturing out towards Mars,
Right.
landing on the moon.
I mean, in your time, Paul. I mean, you're not to date you, or even me for that matter. I mean, the things we do today would have been almost indescribable, when I was born in 1971.
Right.
The things we do, and the fact that information is literally at your fingertips.
Yes.
We can find out anything we want sitting here right now at this moment. We can find out something. In high school, if you ask me something about what's the average weight of an Asian elephant, I would have to go to the library and find out. But
Right.
we can go right to my phone. I can
That's
figure it
right.
out here right now. And that's amazing to me that we've come that far in that short period of time.
Right.
So it'll be interesting to see where we go and how things move on the next few decades, a period of time. So
On the shorter time scale, so we were in the information age, right? Like that's what we've called it, the 90s,
Sure.
2000s.
Right.
We referred. If that name sticks around, I think we're gonna call about a 10-year period the disinformation age. I think that's kind of where we are right now.
that's a good point.
You think we're in a disinformation age?
Yeah.
Or is that the next thing?
No, we're in it.
Yeah? Why do you say that?
So, like, there's these trends. You get something new. I'm going to go back to biology again
Do it.
here, right? So, you got fish, right? And there's fish, and they figure out fins and swim bladders, and then they take over the ocean, and then you got fish for, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of years, and all you find are fish fossils.
Yeah.
Goes from some little simple things to fish pretty quickly. And fish, they got eyes, and they got limbs, and they're doing stuff. They got mouths. And then and they start going on land a little bit, crawling around out on the mud, and that's kind of like working. And then eventually a fish gets some lungs. Now the race is off. It's easy to make a fin into a leg. You already got eyes, you already got a mouth, you already got a stomach. These things work. But now that you got lungs, like 1/3 of the world just opened up. And so it's a race to find out what you can do with all of this. And at first it's like pretty simple. Anybody that can get lungs has it made. Right? You got lungs. Look, man, it's like the California gold rush. There's all this stuff and there's plants and you can just go out there and get whatever you want. And then eventually the predators come in, and then you've got like the race, and you're in the explosion, and they're all figuring it out, and then it eventually settles into some,
So is that, but then,
Well, so where I'm going with information, we had information for the last like 20 years, and so anybody that had access to information had a huge advantage. People that knew how to use it had a huge advantage. But now there's so many people that have access to it. There's a lot of people that don't necessarily. So the predators have moved in to that, figuring out how to weaponize it. I mean, not that we haven't always weaponized information, but not on the scale we are now. Combined with the fact that it's a whole new market. People, when the fish got their lungs, they weren't looking up to the sky for the birds yet. They weren't thinking about like what can go wrong and how does this all plan out. And it's the last 20 years we were just rolling with it because it worked for us, and now we're starting to figure out what are the downsides to the information age. As I'll give a pretty good example that from this last weekend. I'm gonna imitate an auctioneer who was selling some fishing rods at a large
Go full on.
Mennonite auction, and he was going fishing rods. We got this one fishing rod, $5. Anybody got $5? $5? No, not $5. $2. $2. We got $2. $1. We got $1. $2. I got $2. I got $2. $3. Do we have $3? $3. Why is half of the country crazy? $4. Do we got $4? We got $4. All right, sold. So.
Man, so like I like this analogy that you've given of how the predators move in, right?
That's really
And
good. Yeah.
and into the information age. This is something I don't necessarily think about it as far as predators, but there's something that's been sort of on my mind about this information age, or access to information, which is also access to people's presenting them their skills.
Yes.
And that, as that becomes more democratized, it's almost like the presentation of skill is becoming less valuable. So like it's more difficult, I'm finding, in art, and like, you know, the people that I know, it's people in healing arts and people in music and painting and all this stuff. Like, their information is far more available for the teachers and the students and the workers. How are people supposed to, like, when this is, I don't know if this has anything to do with predators or not, but it's just something, I guess it's a little bit of maybe it's a tangent, but I feel like it relates in this way where it's like, what do you think? Do you think that's actually happening? Am I making that up to where it's like there are things the democratization of information, which I'm not saying is bad, is there's a time period where that we might be in here where there's a transition between requiring being compensated for that with money and all this other stuff to where you're not able to get that before it flips over into maybe nobody has to get paid. I don't know.
So you're talking about like Napster thing when that happened, where musicians, their talents were not as valuable anymore?
Well, I
that
mean,
type thing
you
where
can talk
it's
about
available,
Napster,
or
but every mode of dissemination of that information, people want it for free. And they can get it for free or very cheap. And like even the biggest outlets of it, like Spotify, where people are paying a subscription fee, that to them spending $15 a month to have access to an entire library of information. Now the people who are putting information in that library are getting fractions of a penny for it.
So I guess you're kind of talking about, let's say, for instance, okay, you are a talented musician. You and Paul both are very talented musicians. But thanks to this information age, do I even need to know how to play the drums to make a beat?
No, you don't.
Right. So is that what you're talking about more?
Well, no, not so much.
Okay.
I think it has more to do with if we're putting all this information out, if we're in the information age and we're in that explosion, part of that explosion, I think, is that the availability, nobody is going to argue that the availability of information is negative, right? The fact that you can go, whether or not it's just online, and listen to somebody that you don't know, who has no credentials, you just like what they're talking about, that they're there, but also you could log on to MIT and for free take their entire philosophy course or their entire physics course. But then there's the photography, the video, the music, and all these things are being sort of just pumped out there, and it's not so much that. What were you saying about it?
About the...
Is it like you were saying, is it like Napster? No.
Well, it's more like, I'm trying to dissect what you're talking about as far as, you don't need talent anymore, like, because the information is there. I think make
that's
music,
part
and I don't
of
know
it.
anything about music.
I mean, it's the same thing that you would apply to like learning directions and learning how to navigate. Like if you're just using GPS all the time, you're going to get there, but you're not going to remember how or know how when
so
you don't
we're getting
have it.
dumber.
But it's not so
and smarter at the same time.
I wasn't trying
Which
to
is
say
true.
any of that.
That's what's happening.
Well, is that what's happening? Is
I
that
think
part
so.
of the explosion into the next thing? Like, do you guys have any idea what would bring that next thing? Like, what happens with that? You know, do you see that in other fields where there's a skill set that is available, but nobody's paying for it and nobody has to pay that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Are there other? I'm seeing in music.
If you look even in the engineering field and design field, artists, engineering or graphic artists and engineers, I can, instead of hiring a mechanical engineer to do some of the work I need done, I can go to, what's that website called? Fiverr. Fiverr.
Yeah.
I can go to Fiverr and get a guy halfway around the world and for peanuts, and he can design me whatever I want.
Now, is that bad? Is that a negative thing?
It's bad and good, I think.
I think it probably feels bad if you're in it, but the transition to the next thing.
It's kind of one of those things where that industry kind of, it's going away in the sense of the value of it's going away. It used to be when I was a kid, airline pilots, they all made, $200,000 a year. Now, because so many people have their pilot's license and kids are getting their license at 16, that skill is no longer as valuable because you got so many people doing it. And they're pretty much doing it for free for the most part.
what that means for what that will bring. You know what I mean? Because if that stuff does actually fade out, which is sad to think about, because when I think about music and I think about what this stuff has done, we're constantly available. I can, if there are no musicians here and I want to hear music, I just turn on my phone and play whatever I want on demand.
Interesting.
And don't need musicians anymore.
You don't need musicians.
Do the musicians go away? Do the people in this engineering sphere that what you were just talking about? Do they, or the pilots? Do now you have no pilots? Because
I don't think they go away, but I think it's one of the things. Like, think about, it used to be in the turn of the century, labor was cheap, technology was expensive. Now it's flipped. Technology's cheap, labor's expensive. So soon it's going to come to a point where I think
it'd swing back the other way.
It may even swing back the other way, because now so many people are offering their services for nothing. I don't know if it'll create a third group in a white collar, blue collar, and something else, or what.
Well, I think that if we can go back to take it back into the lane where we were too, it's like, all right, so if we think about it in terms of the solution presenting itself, right? Like, it gets worked out. There's a transitional period. It's negative, and then it flips over into this next thing. That, like, for instance, the plastic age, right? Everything we're making is made out of plastic, and it's terrible for it's terrible for the earth. It's terrible for But like, now, have you read about seen any of this stuff where there is like a plastic eating enzyme?
Yeah.
That's starting to. What's that?
Yeah, I hate to say it, but it's going to keep happening throughout nature.
Where there's the solution.
There's calories in the plastic. Something will figure out how to eat them.
How to digest it. You ever heard George Carlin's his comedy skit?
I like that it's going to evolve. I don't like.
I understand.
Plastic animal. Did you hear George Carlin's skit? He talks about plastic. You ever look at it on YouTube at some point? He talks about how the earth kind of wanted plastic, created man to create plastic. In a million years, people will be mining this stuff. This stuff's plastic. Came, 2 million years ago. Some creatures created it, and they'll be mining it and doing whatever with it.
We probably will. And you know what? We probably
think about
will find it'll be like that. Like, it'll just be like, oh, well, these guys just use plastic. What I think is funny, though, when I think about how we assess what we think we know about the past or whatever is through these, like, ruins. And I always think about, like, when I'm driving over the Bay Bridge. I'm like, one day, maybe it'll just be the two tower pieces that are out in the middle of the water, just sticking up barely. And people will be like, oh, it's a ritual site that they used to
exactly.
Have, right? We know everything about what they're doing. This was here. It's only ever been these two towers, and they used to do sacrifices here.
Right.
There were watchouts, lookout towers.
Yeah, there was a movie about that. I think it came in the 80s or something. It was set in the future, and they took this toilet seat, and they were like, yeah, this is a ritual thing of the ancient ones. And they put it around their neck. They wore it around their necks, and like, wow.
XKCD has a good cartoon about that, where a time traveler comes back from the future to talk to some guy, and he's like, the time traveler is obsessed with spiders. And he's like, oh, our whole future, we love spiders. They're amazing. They're so cool. We got all the fossils of them. They get all the legs and the mouthpieces. We love them. And then the main character is like, well, what type of spider webs do you like? And he's like, what's a spider web? So, I have to think about that when I'm like thinking about like fossil animals.
Right.
And you're like, we know it because it has a particularly rigid leg bone that tend to preserve well, but like
that's a little bit too like
time,
the drones that are being developed now. As the drones get developed, you're not going to need pilots.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right.
So that will become a non-existent job.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that. I went to a meeting. It was years ago. I think I was active duty at the time, and it was at the Pentagon, and they were talking about how in 2040 they're going to look at trying to come to a pilotless Navy, and I laughed. And the admiral was like, Commander Jordan, what's so funny? And I was like, that's hilarious. I think you'll always have pilots. And he said, well, in 1900, if you said there were no horses in the Army by 1945, and I was like, oh, interesting.
Well, I mean, but this is something though that I think about too, because like I think it's what I'm trying to tap on by saying, do you think these things are going to disappear? The thing that I do know is that people are mostly motivated and have to be. The situation that we are living in, the way that civilization is set up, is you have to earn the money in order to function. So if the thing that you are expecting to do that earns you a living no longer earns you a living, it's more and more likely that you will be unable to engage in that activity and therefore will go away. So if you have a situation where you have unmanned aircraft, it's right there, it says in it, unmanned aircraft, we don't need you. You're not going to need somebody to be able to be a pilot. So then will that skill go away?
I think it will at some point. And even now, airline pilots are more systems operators than pilots, you know, because I talked to a lot of these kids now that are coming out of flight school. You know, they can't do navigation, they can't do point to points, you know, that we learned, you know, in flight school. And, you know, when the autopilot goes down, they're like, well, it's broken, we're not flying. I'm like, don't you have wings?
Yeah, right.
You know, but they're not. They're taught differently. So, yeah, I think those jobs will go away and we'll have to do other things. I mean, think about, you know, in the railroad industry, there was a telegraph operator, you know, that led all the trains, you know, let towns know when the train's coming. And they went away. And there was a huge deal. And I think it was in the early 1900s when the last one went away because they were like, what are we going to do now? Yeah. We have these skills. We know Morse code. What can we do? And they had to do other things. They got this new thing called radio that's coming out. You know, you guys will take jobs doing that. And they were like, I don't know anything about this radio stuff.
Yeah, right.
You know, but that's what they did. They kind of moved on and did other things.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's the silver lining is I mean, as long as I've known Paul, and that's not even a long time. You know, you have told me that a long time ago, you made a decision to pursue the knowledge for knowledge's sake and the art for art's sake, regardless of the money. And that has led you to not only one kind of development in that art, but like multiple. Like I could probably count at least 4 if you count the way that you play the drums, which is unique to you and your own expression, and then the involvement that you had with you and Jimmy Lyons, you and Larry Willis, and if I may be so arrogant, the things that we're playing now that are all were different, that were not fueled by the desire to or the ability to make a bunch of money doing it.
Right.
And maybe if we're coming to this point where the skills remain, but there's no longer a monetary mechanism,
right?
That the skill, like what you say, okay, well, we have this Morse code. That now what are we going to do with it? Or now we've developed all this intricate astronomy navigation. What are we going to do with it? Maybe that's when it you'll see when there's no longer the requisite, you know, like this professional parameter that's required of it. It will be able to flip out into what it is going to do next.
Right.
The evolution occurs.
Right.
And maybe that's part of the explosion that we're in.
I think so. I think so. What's next? Yeah. I don't know. We were talking about it yesterday. You know, that's the next big thing, you know. Yeah. And to lead that and to recognize it, you know, would be great. But we just don't know. Like Matt made a good point. You know, when the fish came out of the water with lungs, we got lungs now. But they didn't think, okay, well, what about birds? They couldn't see that far yet. Yeah. I mean, it just wasn't there.
Yeah. Yeah, and it takes a while to figure out that new space. You know, and you start off, you come out of the water and you're like, oh man, there's some leaves. I can eat leaves. Yeah, but then you get enough of the only thing that's out there eats like one leaf, and then you realize that, hey, maybe if I could figure out how to eat bark or moss or whatever else, and then you diversify, and then it gets more complicated because then you get competition, you get predators, and then you find new niches, and the whole thing rolls around for an extended period of time, and it comes out to some new society that's somewhat stable.
But like the study of flight, I mean, that's been going on for thousands of years.
Right.
The study of it. And there were only a few that really innovated the conditions of flight. And now, I mean, we launched yesterday, I think.
Privately.
So,
private owned.
that goes also with the music. I mean, there's a lot of music, but there's still room to grow in music.
Right. What's next? Right.
What's coming, where it's going, what'll it do, what will it bring forth.
It seems to me too, it's often the case that those frontiers, maybe not necessarily aviation and music, but like a lot of times they're intertwined. I mean, I know we've talked about it before, but even as a more specific examples, I mean, Stockhausen was a big fan of Einstein. You know, like then, and he, like him or not, and that's old stuff now, 1950, but like it or not, he developed something that was totally different. And he was using, as inspiration, he was using the theory of relativity. He was using quantum mechanics and those sorts of things back then. And I think that, I mean, you can read about people who, I mean, man, you read about physicists now that are studying what John Coltrane did, and talking about the sacred geometry that is created by the harmonic sequencings that he did and everything, and it has inspired them to take their discipline further. It's going to be really interesting because, I mean, I don't know. I feel like I haven't been here that long. And I get more perceptive the older I get, so like maybe the connections that you're putting together are just like, they're not new or anything. But I do think that it's going to be interesting to see. I think we're in this time, like you said, it's like this explosion. Something's got to happen because I know that I talk to a lot of different kinds of people, and everybody feels like they're part of a movement that's taking place, that's transitioning into the next era of whatever it's going to be. And I don't know. I don't know if I feel like that. I think I want to feel like that. I don't know if I just feel the desire to feel like that or I actually feel like that. But I think I do feel like something is going to happen sooner than not.
But like, I mean, I think our whole lives were going to be in the explosion. And one of the things about the explosion is that like strategies come and go quickly. And so things that used to exist just don't exist anymore, and then new things exist, and there's some overarching trends throughout everything that kind of tends to like show up over and over again. Like if you got long jaws and sharp teeth, you can grab slippery things, like this. There's some trends, but like for the most part, it's gonna jump so quick, like who manages the trains, and then like 200 years later, you're debating in one lifetime about who signals the trains, and then 200 years later, the concept of a train doesn't really make any sense anymore. It's just going to be weirdness like that. For sure. We're in weird times.
Well, I think that one thing that as we wind down is that these, I don't know. I think it's part of that pushing forward is that something is going to fall off. I read The Harmillarium, which is an Arnold Schoenberg book about harmony. And Arnold Schoenberg was sort of one of the founding fathers of the atonal movement in music. And love him or hate him, whatever, I read the book. I really enjoyed it. I liked his writings more than I like his music, but he said something that stuck with me when I read it. It said, in order for there's something to add on, something falls off.
Right.
And so it's not so much that you want everything to stay intact the way it is, right? Like you said, there's the horses in the army, no horses. The trains, there's not going to be any trains. There's going to be something that comes along with that. And I think that's something that we can apply to this general idea of innovation and creativity that we have. When I hear people speak about this idea of having to know and regurgitate every single thing that came before them that was important, you're going to lose a little bit of that.
Yes.
But doesn't mean that it's totally gone and that what's happening now isn't valid. It requires the room. There's not enough space in there for all of it, it doesn't seem.
Right.
But maybe I'm wrong about that, but it certainly is helpful to approach the things like that to remember that. And these are all prime examples again of it that we're talking about now. So, yeah. Thank you guys.
Yeah, anytime.
This is fun.
Thank you. Thank TechPort.
Yeah. Always a pleasure to be here in the hangar, noisy or not. And, speaking of noisy hangar, we recorded a record in here last month. We got like 20 tracks to go through and put together something for you guys to listen to. So I will say two things as we part. When we had the record, I hope you'll listen to it. I appreciate you being here to enjoy the show. And if you yourself are working on something that you feel is unconventional or outside the box or new or any of that stuff, I'm sure, I know I would, but I'm sure we all would love to hear about it.
Absolutely.
So I don't care where you are or what you're doing, get in touch. ProgressCulture.org, info at spiritinnovationfreedom.com. We are interested and curious. So, thank you. See you
Thank you all so much for being with us. We are grateful that you give us your consideration and attention. Please follow and reach out to the Spirit of Innovation and Freedom and TechPort on Facebook and YouTube, or at spiritinnovationfreedom.com and techportsomd.org, and also www.progressculture.org. Let us know what you're thinking and what you want to hear about and how you're feeling. We'd love to hear from you, and we'd love to see you again next week on Progress Culture. Thank you, much love, and see you soon.